He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs, carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. Isaiah 53, 3-5. Let's pray. Father, would you speak your message through me as we tackle a very weighty and difficult topic? And would you fall upon this room, and would there be a spirit of rest, but diligence upon this room as we tackle this topic, which has been here since we were here, since mankind was here. Bless the reading of your word. We thank you for your word, and I ask that you keep us attentive and keep us focused on what you want to say in Jesus' name. All right, now, let me first really quickly break down what's going to happen. The first 8-ish minutes of this is going to be straight up a crash course on the problem of evil, what it is. It's going to be a little dense, okay? So it might you might find yourself like going 100 miles an hour, like a lot of details. Bear with me. It's important that I define it, I explain it before we get into its implications for evangelism. Because I think the problem of evil comes up in every evangelistic context in some way, shape, or form. If they're not bringing it up, we're bringing it up because we're talking about sin. And if they're bringing it up, it's likely their reason for not believing in God. Well, let's just define it. The problem of evil can be defined as such. It was first formulated by a Greek philosopher named Epicurus. It's on the slide here. You can follow along. Essentially, it goes like this. God either wishes to take away evils and is unable, or he is able and unwilling, or he is neither willing or able, or he is both willing and able. And it breaks down like this. If God is willing but unable, he's not all-powerful because he wants to do something, but he can't. If God is able but unwilling, he's malevolent, meaning he could do it, but he chooses not to, and that would make him evil. If God is neither willing nor able, then he's both malevolent and feeble. And then lastly, if God is both willing and able, then why does evil exist? Now, let me be very upfront first. There are two versions of this problem. There is the logical argument which says God and evil cannot logically coexist. Kind of like a married person can't be a bachelor or a circle can't be a square. That there is a logical inconsistency which immediately shows God can't exist. Okay, here we have evil. We know it exists. Therefore, God must not be able to exist by logical necessity. Now, I want to mention, and then there's the probabilistic argument, which essentially makes a different claim, more modest claim that says, look, it might be logically possible, but come on. The amount of evil in the world, how could God allow this? Why would God allow this? And so it's more of a probability argument. Look, they're not logically inconsistent, but come on. How could such evil exist and God still be good? How could we even worship him? Now, I want to first start by saying that the logical argument has been widely rejected by philosophers because at the end of the day, there's nothing inherently contradictory about evil and God. There's like if I tell you right now, close your eyes and imagine a circle, and I say it has 4 sides, 4 corners, you immediately know that I'm not describing a circle. There's something self-evident in my explanation that makes it logically inconsistent. Well, there's nothing self-evident in evil existing and God existing that makes it logically inconsistent. What we really are saying is the probability argument. Okay, maybe that could be true, but it's hard to believe that when I see people suffering in the way that they are. It seems like there's no purpose for it. In other words, it's what philosophers would call gratuitous suffering. Like, how do we explain the random acts, natural acts of violence, or the random acts of human violence? How could we explain that? Therefore, it's probably true that God does not exist. which leaves us with that argument to deal with, the probabilistic argument. Now, we just talked about worldviews. Before we go forward, before we talk about what Christianity has to say about this, we have to explore some alternative answers, which I find to be unsatisfactory. Atheism, or naturalism, does not and cannot explain our moral objectives. When the atheist basically claims that the problem of evil disappears because, well, evil exists in a godless, purposeless world. The problem vanishes. But clearly that's not satisfactory. None of us are saying, oh, okay, I feel better. You're just telling me I shouldn't think about it. That's part of what Matt was saying. It has no explanatory power to just say, there is no problem. We know that's not the case. There is a problem. And it cannot explain, atheism has a lot of problems. There's more reasons not to believe it than to believe it. But one of the biggest ones is it can't explain to us why we would even notice the problem. Who gave us our moral agency? How would we know something is wrong unless we were given, or rather, unless we could compare it to something ultimately right? You only know a crooked line is crooked because you have a straight one to compare it to. And if atheism says there's no lines, well, that's problematic. Evil in atheism is just disadvantageous for survival or unfashionable. But none of us would say that rape or murder or gratuitous suffering of children or lying to others is wrong only because it does not aid survival. No, something in us cries out for justice. Something within us cries out for justice. Atheism can't explain that. Next, a finite or evil God theory. This essentially says that, well, okay, God, the problem is God can't. There's some things he can't do. He's not really infinite. He's finite. So he's more powerful than us, but he's not like all powerful. And then conversely, well, God is all powerful, but he's also kind of evil. So there's a part of him that think of a dictator. You know, God, you're either painting him as somebody who can't do everything or painting him as somebody who's a dictator. In a very, I'm going to try really hard to condense this because this is, books and books are written about why this doesn't work. Remember what I told you about the square and the circle? You guys remember that? A circle can't have 4 points, right? You guys, okay, good. All right, we all passed geography. But we, little school joke. I didn't do good in high school, so no. But if I explain to you a circle and say 4 points, you know I'm not explaining a circle. The conversation ends. It doesn't matter what we say after. I didn't start by explaining the right properties of a circle. So if I say God is finite, I've just made a circle square. God, by definition, cannot be finite. Otherwise, we're just talking about a really powerful alien. We're not talking about God. The question is not the definition of God. We know what that is, a maximally great being. The question is, does he exist? Is he real? Nobody questions whether God is all-powerful. What most people question is how an all-powerful God could exist. So by logical necessity, a finite God or an evil God would violate the very definition of God and that thus be nonsense. Next, we have relativism. This is this is the culture of today. The postmodern relativism, which basically says, look, evil does not truly exist. It's just a matter of perspective. If you can ascend high enough, a lot of religions like Hinduism and Buddhism affirm this. If you could ascend high enough in consciousness, you would see that all evil is just a matter of point of view. You guys ever seen that meme? It's like a 6 on the floor, and like one person's looking at it, is like, it's a 9. The other person's like, it's 6. And it's like, oh, see, like, not everything is black and white. And I'm like, well, there's still a picture showing us the outside view of this. That's black and white. Like, the fact that number inverts is black and white. So relativism can't really answer it because similarly the problem kind of vanishes because they go a step further than atheism. Atheism just says evil exists, we have to deal with it. Relativism says there is no evil. That would be very hard. I struggle to think that anybody who lived in Nazi Germany could think that morality is relative. Or anybody who's visited Auschwitz could think truly that morality is relative. That really all that was bad about this was that it just wasn't aiding our survival. And we just need to clean it up and no. Nobody operates like that. Even if their worldview that they proclaim says that, nobody thinks that way. I wonder why. A 6th century Zen poem puts it this way: if you want to get to the plain truth, be not concerned with right and wrong. The conflict between right and wrong is a sickness of the mind. Did you notice something? Did anybody catch what happened in that poem? Get to the plain truth. Sickness of the mind. Those seem to be presenting ideals. So it could be restated as such: there is no right and wrong at conflict with one another. 2, to focus on right and wrongs is a sickness of the mind which can be understood as wrong. Both statements contradict one another, therefore, the argument fails. You are imposing a moral objective by saying there's no moral objectives. You're saying it is better to not do this. Well, where's your objective to say that? And so it fails to describe, and just based on common sense, all of us know evil exists. It's not a matter of perspective. It's not. There's some things that just can't be explained. Now, natural evils, perhaps, you lose your house, you lose a car, and then, 2 years down the line, you see that it all worked out for good. That's different. They're saying all evil, the worst thing you can think of, is just a matter of perspective. To me, that fails to explain the problem. Lastly, karma and reincarnation. We live in a culture of Facebook sharing things about karma. And it's funny because karma is described as a law, like a natural law, that adjudicates between right and wrong, rewarding, giving justice to wrong things, and rewarding right things, right? It's described like gravity, okay? Like this is just a natural part of the universe. It is true whether you like it or not. Just like I can't just start flying right now, karma is true. But how on earth could something in the natural world, could a natural law speak to metaphysical, non-physical entities like morality and consciousness? It doesn't make sense. Gravity is just the term we use to describe what we see happening. But that's not what they're saying. They're saying this is an actual natural law which adjudicates. Another thing that's wrong with karma and reincarnation, often adopted by religions like Hinduism and Buddhism, is they don't believe in a soul. They don't believe in a soul that sustains after death. So if I'm wronged and I die, how is karma going to return to me if I don't go on? In other words, it might dress up that there is it might have the illusion of design, meaning this suffering will lead to something better, but it certainly shouldn't comfort the individual who was harmed because you're not going to exist after death. Some future tree will receive justice in your honor, or whatever you reincarnate as, or the universe itself. But clearly that doesn't speak to the problem. Our concern with evil is not that it affects the universe. It's that it affects us and people. So answering the problem. Now, remember, we can answer this problem philosophically. And so let's first break down the probabilistic argument really quick. All it says is that it's highly unlikely. If I told you right now that I was a New York City ballet dancer, there's nothing I appreciate one person believing in me. Y'all didn't believe in me. There's nothing logically inconsistent with that statement. I am a person. I could be a New York City ballet dancer. However, given my size, given where I live, given other things, it is highly unlikely that I am. So here's an example of how something could be logically consistent. Yeah, this person could be, but highly improbable that he is based on the evidence. This person lives in Newport Richie. How is he in New York City? I see him every day. Chloe would know if I was a New York City ballet dancer, and she would be very happy. But let me ask you this. Are we in a good position to weigh infinite probabilities? You see, you can find out if I'm a New York City ballet dancer because there's a finite amount of evidence you need before that becomes convincing. You don't have to look far to say, okay, he's definitely not that, right? Other lies are a little harder. I'm a great guy. I don't really know. I have to explore with you some years to know that. But the existence of evil in the universe having some morally sufficient reason by God, are we really in a position to weigh all of the evil events in all of human history at once? Of course not. And so what happens is, though this problem carries weight philosophically, it's an impossible task. How can we sit there? We don't even know what's happening a county over. We don't even know what's happening in that room. If people have anybody in that room, well, there's no childcare, right? Okay, we don't know what's happening in that room. Something could be in that room, then we don't know it. We don't know exactly what is occurring. So how could we weigh the probability as finite human beings of moral actions? We're simply not in a good position to do it. So since we can't do it, that puts us in a little bit of a bind. However, I want you to be encouraged. Arguments in support for God's existence do not exist in a vacuum. In other words, this is not the only source of evidence we have. However we solve this problem is not the only way. There is a plethora of arguments that support the existence of God, that support an initial beginning to the universe, that support evidence that we have objective moral standards, because I don't know anybody who doesn't think objectively about morals. Our politics should be an example of this. Most people who say you shouldn't judge others are making a judgment. Now here's the thing. The problem of evil is a philosophical argument. It's asked and answered in philosophical textbooks and among professional philosophers. And there are satisfactory philosophical answers to this. We just answered them. Congrats. Anybody feel better? Not me. Because guess what? None of this is helpful. We've laid out the philosophical argument, and it's sound. It's accepted. It's sound. It passes the test of philosophical answers. Yet it's not enough. Evil's still disturbing. Still bothers us at night. The fear of death and our own suffering causes us doubts as to whether God is up there and if he's good. Now, since most people's problem with evil is not philosophical, but historical, personal, emotional, philosophical arguments and even theological arguments are only going to go so far. And we must engage this question beyond philosophy. Because however long that was that I was talking, I just gave you a breakdown as to the end of it. That's the philosophical discussion. But it's not enough. That won't change anything. Now, I'm going to be vulnerable and just share what I believe to be the problem with the church. You guys ready? And this doesn't apply to any of you, of course not. It's only for the people who didn't show up. All right. I believe that the church suffers from a culture of pain denial. We experience pain, but we've diluted our theology to being centered around the reduction or the removal of our pain. Oddly enough, this was not the biblical message. Yet American churches have adopted this type of implicit demand towards Scripture. We have spiritualized our language of denial. We call a lack of introspection, for example, joy. Somebody who ignores all of their emotions, ignores all of the way they relate to other people, and is constantly happy, of course they should be. They're not aware of their sin. Now, I want you to understand something, that the concept of denying our emotions is usually met with a couple misconceptions. For example, some people say, well, why are you asking people to feel bad things? Like, why are you asking them to take on negative feelings? If somebody just wants to live blissful and you know, not have to think about those things, why are you telling them that they have to? The problem is not that we have to feel anything. The problem is we do feel things and we suppress them. We do feel this. We feel doubts, sadness, anger, bitterness. Let me give you an example. I was driving a couple weeks ago on 54, and I saw some guy literally from the gas station not look, just bursted out into traffic and almost hit someone. And he looked like to be in some huge hurry. He then is coming, and I'm all the way in the left lane, and I'm like, oh, he's definitely coming to my lane. I'm like hoping to avoid him. He ends up getting close to my lane, and you know when you're like, I'm definitely close enough that he wouldn't do it. He's smart. Why would he do that? Both of us can be hurt. And he was not smart. After all, he lunged through. And I had to hit my brakes super hard. I was angry. Now, I could say to you that I was angry at the fact that he was driving so recklessly, which is true. Or I could be honest and say I wanted to hurt him. Had I had the chance, I might have hurt him. My problem with what he did was not just philosophical. It affected me, and I wanted to hurt him. Thank God I didn't, and I didn't get a chance to. But what I just said was really how I felt. Now, I am not giving a moral appraisal of that. I'm not saying it would have been good for me to hurt him, but I felt it. And if I cannot arrive at honesty about the things that I feel, then I've never arrived. How often? All of us have led groups. All of us have been around people sharing painful stories. Because remember, the problem of evil, it's not just philosophical. People experience evil in their life. People die. People get diseases. Okay, people have anxiety and debilitating disorders. Or some people have a very good life, but they observe evil in the world and they're sensitive to it. How often, I know I've done this, when somebody is sharing something painful, and especially something painful about their own life, do we calm their waters? The very waters God might have been trying to stir up. See, we think we're helping them, but we're really delaying them. Sometimes God brings a storm to someone's life. And sometimes he asks us to go sit with them in the storm, and we go try to stop it. Naturally, we think removing pain is helpful, but anybody who is grieved knows that anybody approaching you trying to take away your pain is the last person you want to be around. How many of you have grieved something in your life? By a show of hands. Interesting. A lot of pain in this room. All of you have wounds. Let me ask you, in the thick of your grief, if I came in and said, just trust God. God is good. Everything's going to be okay. How would you receive that? I imagine poorly. You'd probably feel like I was trying to fix you. You'd probably feel like I was trying to change your emotional state, which, by the way, was natural and justified. Now, if you said, I'm sad, I'm going to go steal all the bottle caps of the Coca-Cola bottles at Walmart, then I might say, you have a right to be sad, but let's go ahead and think about that before we do it. But that's different. That might be an analysis of what they want to do with their emotion, but never did God call us to suppress other people's emotions when we minister to them. That doesn't make sense. In fact, I think God wants to find them there. Otherwise, what are we doing when we worship? Is anybody here worship just like, there's some, I've done it, but I'm sure most of you, when you worship, you want to experience something. Experience is an emotional term. It's an affect term. Went off track. All right, let's get back on it. Now, notice I said that we are not the ones stirring them up, because then we can get people who are like, got it, I'm going to be a jerk to everybody and make them very sad, because sadness is sometimes good. No. God may be stirring somebody up. In fact, God may be stirring you up. The question is not, should we go around stirring the waters in others, but are we aligning with what God is doing in them? God may be trying to calm somebody, and we might be stirring them up. But more often than not, I think our church suffers from one of two ways of denying their emotions. There are two ways we do this: avoidance or engagement. Avoidance can look a few ways. Two examples. Christians tend to theologize our suffering and trivialize other suffering. You know your actions are avoidant if they prevent you from feeling real emotions, the emotions you would have felt had you not taken that course of actions. So think about your own life, and I'm going to give an example. A man loses his job, and the feeling of disappointment and sadness welling up. Then he says, it's okay. God is going to find me something better. This must be for my good. The feelings disappear altogether. Now, you might look at that and say, oh, wow, he was encouraged by the end of it. Everything we know, by the way, if you're wondering, my background's in counseling. That's my major. Everything we know about the human brain and the way emotions work, barring somebody who has severe psychological disorders disabling them from feeling, is that human beings have ways of dealing with emotion, but most human beings feel these things. So in other words, this statement may be true theologically, but it's inauthentic to the person. And yet, they might have convinced themselves that it is. Have you ever talked your way out of feeling genuine sadness or disappointment? In doing so, I want you to imagine your child. We have parents in the room. Imagine your child crying because they didn't get something that you were going to give them. And now imagine your child, instead of coming to you crying, waiting until they stopped crying, or rather forcing themselves to stop crying, coming up to you and saying, I recognize that you are a good father and good mother, and that you wouldn't withhold anything good from me. My emotions are really just my perspective. I imagine that would feel like your child was actually distancing themselves from you, not that they were drawing closer to you. You would feel, even if your child is right, that your child had not come to you honestly, trusting you to love them anyway. Now, engagement involves the opposite. Trusting God by suffering, and tending to others' suffering. So instead of trivializing another person's pain, saying, well, it's not all that bad, it could be worse, or God is going to make everything better, we enter and engage and tend to their suffering. One way that we could do this is by being authentic about the fact that suffering is painful and not trying to say something. You know, when I watch movies like that are made by Christians, sometimes I feel like they're trying to paint a very interesting image of Christians as really people who look out of touch with reality. And then they theologize that by saying, well, they just have the joy of the Lord. Why don't you? And I don't think anybody here truly resonates with that. I think most people think, like people that come on this stage and talk like that, oh, wow, most people are discouraged. I could never be that godly. Let me let you in on something. They're not that godly. Trusting God by suffering. You know, suffering is a verb. Sometimes you choose to suffer. Does anybody work out? You choose to suffer. John hit me with this. We can trust God that our suffering will not ruin us, because that's what most of us are afraid of, you guys. We're afraid if we let it out, okay, if I let these tears flow, they won't stop. What's that code for? I'll be alone. God won't be there. And he won't sustain me. In other words, it's the suppressing of our emotion that reflects a disbelief in him, not the expression of it. We shouldn't be afraid of our Father. But we are. And we can trust that it won't ruin us and move us further from God because he promises to be close to us. We can also trust that he'll sustain us in our suffering. We need not deny our inner worlds, but find our inner worlds. In our inner worlds, the presence of our Father who loves us. We can only do that if we're not closed off to it. There are parts of you that you may not be aware God has been longing to access, and you have used his very word to keep him out of it. And he yells from heaven, don't put words in my mouth. Does any of this make sense? Have you guys experienced this in the church? Kind of a downplaying of suffering? Everything's okay? I mean, I'm not saying that every time someone asks you how you're doing, give them your life story. That's obviously not practical. But you understand that there is a tone with which Christians talk. One that seems to suggest suffering is some distant reality. And what's more disturbing is when it hits them, they still talk that way. And even sometimes what happens is, because they've never explored these topics, when it hits them, it breaks them. And the very door they came in, denying emotion, they leave expressing it. What a shame. It should be the other way around. My phone keeps locking. All right. Now, did you notice the difference between those two examples I gave? Oh, I haven't given the second one. All right, this is an example of the second one. Testing you guys. You guys taking notes, right? All right, a man loses his job. He starts to feel sadness and disappointment and allows himself to feel it. He expresses these emotions to God, and in doing so, starts to feel peace. Did you notice the difference between the two? Allowing ourselves to experience our suffering is the only way we could access God as comforter. In the first example, God's peace became a form of trivializing the pain the man felt. In the second example, God's peace was experienced. God cannot bring peace waters that you've already stilled. When we approach God apart from our suffering, then all of the attributes of God associated with redeeming suffering, we never get to experience. For example, not everybody, goodness, that's mean. A lot of you are in romantic relationships. All right. Who here knew without a shadow of a doubt, or rather, who here did not know whether the person that they're with liked them back when they asked them out? Okay? When you asked them out, you made yourselves vulnerable to probably the most painful feeling, which is rejection. But in doing so, you made yourself sensitive to the most gratifying answer that a really risky question can get, which is, yeah, I like you back. You would not have felt the exhilaration from that had you known. Had you safely found a way to still those waters of anxiety by asking a friend to ask a friend to ask a friend and figure, hey, is she feeling me, you know what I'm saying? If you in what you're doing there, what you're really doing is calming the fear of rejection in you. But when you when you say, I'm not God, I don't calm myself, and approach with the fear of rejection, you may be hurt greatly. But guess what? You may also experience a joy that the other guy, no chance he could experience because he never approached it truly vulnerably. That's the image I'm trying to paint. Sometimes engaging suffering and approaching God will make us doubt if he's going to help us. I want you to imagine your guys' selves on a cliff, a very large cliff with a deep abyss beneath you. And attached to your waist is a rope. And that rope is tied to a sturdy oak stump, okay? That rope is all curled up. And someone tells you, jump. And you say, well, I'm a little afraid to jump because I'll probably die if I jump. So I'm going to go ahead and say no. But here's the thing. If they told you, no, you can jump, that rope is going to protect you. It doesn't matter how convincing that person is. It doesn't matter how long your discussion about the properties of the rope and the weight. You'll never experience the strength of that rope until you jump. You can think it's strong, but then there's one thing to trust it's strong when you jump. And so you might be looking at the cord, you're like, you know what, that seems sturdy enough, that goes down further enough. I'm sure this will hold me. I weigh a certain amount. This rope is a certain amount strong. That's the philosophical problem of evil right there. That's what we're doing. Well, these are the properties of it, but we'll never know that rope to be secure unless we risk death to find out. Sometimes God is calling us to jump and trust him as our secure rope. Now, this theology which hides suffering, pain, weakness, sin, it's widespread. It should be no surprise to us that many Christian leaders feel they cannot expose these things about them. They can't expose their weaknesses, their sins. When was the last time you heard a pastor talk about the fight they had with their wife on the way to church? Not 18 years ago, back when they were sinners. I'm talking about like on the way to church, where you were honest. You know what I mean? What would it be like for that to happen? Well, maybe we'd have less abuses of power. Maybe Ravi Zacharias wouldn't have done what he did if he embraced his own wickedness and sought community help, rather than saying, I'm helping a lot of people with my words, I must keep appearances. What good is that compared to eternity? Now, we do this in more subtle ways than that, obviously. But I think in order to be effective as a minister of the gospel, we must learn to suffer. We can't answer the problem of evil from a philosophical point. We must take up our cross. The cross is I hope you know, the cross is the grandest depiction of suffering that we have. Being asked to take up our cross is being asked specifically to follow after Christ. Now, what answer does Christianity provide? Well, we could say it provides a real and practical answer. What Matt was talking about, Christianity has explanatory power as to why this stuff exists. Well, the reason that Christianity, above all other religious beliefs, above all other worldviews, satisfies the problem of evil is because the solution involved suffering. No other religion worships a God who knows the suffering of their creatures firsthand. We worship a suffering God. If God exists, which we've established is likely, then Jesus was and remains the most undeserving, innocent victim in the history of mankind. The most innocent person you can think of, by definition, is not as innocent as he. If we truly understood his innocence and our guiltiness, we would ask the problem of evil about Jesus, only to be immediately met with the fact that our salvation and the world's hope would be impossible apart from Christ's death on the cross. In other words, God became the problem of evil. He didn't just bear our sin, he did. He was innocence. You see, the problem of evil is complaining of innocent suffering. It's saying, how could innocent people suffer? How could an innocent child suffer in this way? And the solution by God is not to say, well, deal with it. The solution by God, the maximally great being from which all things flow, was to put on the suffering of his complainers. If our approach to the problem of evil is devoid of emotional engagement and denying of the fact that we worship a God who quite literally became the problem itself, then we do a great disservice to the people we speak to. Not only do we come across naive, but we miss the point of the cross. In God becoming the problem of evil, it showed that sometimes evil is necessary to accomplish good. Jesus had to die. And yet, we never ask, how could Jesus have died? Maybe we don't really know just how innocent and good he was. Maybe there's something about our perception that is naturally finite. And that's hard to marry these two topics. But we worship a God who sympathizes with our weakness. That verse carries far more power to me when I think of the problem of evil. Like, people just kind of throw that verse around. That's Jesus literally saying, I'm God. I created everything. And I sympathize with you, dust, your weakness, because I experienced it firsthand. All of the shame, all of the pain, all of the suffering of humanity was placed on Jesus in 3 hours. What would have taken an eternity to complete in hell, he suffered on the cross. I'll end with this. And some of what I wanted to say was kind of jumbled up. I hope the message got through that. To engage this problem, we must be astute. We have to know how philosophers answer this. We can't just be like, disregard that. That's important. Philosophy is just measuring ultimate reality. So we gotta be kind of educated on that. But we will not reach a soul if we are not willing to suffer. How could we provide a solution for suffering that we're not willing to enter into? That we don't believe God good enough to sustain us in? Because the truth of the matter is, guys, he doesn't always remove our suffering. But he didn't do it to himself either. He didn't remove his own cup. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.